They called themselves the Ant Hill Kids. But what happened inside that isolated commune in rural Quebec was nothing short of a living nightmare. Imagine being told the world outside was poisoned, that only your leader could save you, and that every act of suffering you endured was for your salvation. This was no religion. This was the calculated creation of a prison built from fear, blind obedience, and the charisma of one man, Roch Thériault. Roch wasn't born into power. He was a French-Canadian man from Saguenay, Quebec, who grew up in a strict Catholic household. In his early years, nothing suggested the horrors he would later commit. He married young, had children, but struggled to keep steady work. By the late 1970s, something changed. He became obsessed with the Old Testament and apocalyptic visions. He began giving small sermons, attracting people disillusioned with mainstream religion. Roch told them the world would end in 1979, destroyed by a massive flood. But he claimed God had given him a mission: gather the chosen few, live off the land, and prepare for the new world. To his followers, he seemed intelligent, warm, and protective. He promised them health, spiritual safety, and a purpose. His persuasive words were enough to make them abandon their homes, jobs, and even their families. Slowly, he built his group, about a dozen men and women, and relocated them to a remote area in Ste. Marie, Quebec. There, they worked endlessly to build cabins, farm the land, and survive without outside help. Roch demanded total devotion. His followers called him Moses. He claimed his guidance came directly from God. When 1979 came and went without the promised flood, most leaders would have lost credibility. But Roch used the failure to tighten control. He told them that God had spared the earth because of their faith, and that now, more than ever, they had to cut ties with the outside world, especially with anyone who might challenge him. This was when the Ant Hill Kids became truly dangerous. The name came from the way they worked, tirelessly, day and night, like ants, to build and maintain the commune. But behind the hard labor was a structure of power that centered entirely on Roch. He decided who ate, who slept, who married, and who was punished. At first, the punishments were mild: public humiliation, extra chores. But they escalated. Roch began accusing members of sins they hadn't committed, forcing them to confess to imaginary wrongdoings. He controlled what they read, what they said, and even how they thought. Anyone who questioned him was told they were possessed by evil spirits. By 1980, the commune had moved deeper into the wilderness, near Burnt River, Ontario, to avoid government attention. The isolation was perfect for Roch. He banned contact with outsiders, saying they were agents of Satan. It was here that the rules became harsher, the punishments more brutal, and the so-called prophet transformed into a dictator. Food was scarce, yet Roch always had enough for himself. The others were made to fast, sometimes for days, under the guise of purification. Children were born into the commune, completely cut off from the real world. Roch claimed the children were his, and many were. He took multiple wives from his followers, deciding who would bear his chosen offspring. Outsiders who encountered the group often described them as strangely cheerful and obedient. They wore handmade clothes, spoke softly, and followed Roch's every movement with their eyes. But behind the scenes, fear ruled every second of their lives. For years, the world had no idea what was happening in that remote Canadian forest. The Ant Hill Kids had become invisible, and that was exactly how Roch wanted it. But inside, cracks were starting to form. Some followers were quietly questioning his teachings. A few had tried to leave but were. By the early 1980s, Roch Thériault's control over the Ant Hill Kids had become absolute. He dictated every movement, every bite of food, every word spoken inside the commune. Outsiders no longer saw him as a harmless back-to-the-land spiritual leader. Those who got too close began to sense something far darker. But without phones, without visitors, without any connection to the outside world, his followers had nowhere to turn. The punishments were no longer symbolic. Roch now used physical pain as a form of purification. If a follower broke a rule, or if he decided they had, they might be whipped, beaten, or made to stand naked in the freezing Canadian winter. Sometimes he'd make them eat dead mice or animal droppings, telling them it would cleanse their sins. His followers accepted it because they believed every word he said came from God. The children born in the commune knew no other life. They worked alongside the adults, chopping wood, hauling water, and building whatever Roch demanded. They didn't attend school. Education came only from him, and it was filled with his warped teachings. They were taught that Roch was the only true prophet and that outsiders were dangerous. Roch's paranoia grew worse. He began drinking heavily, claiming it helped him speak to God. Alcohol turned him volatile. His sermons shifted from visions of salvation to violent rants about punishment and loyalty. Disobedience, no matter how small, was met with cruelty. Medical care in the commune became another tool of control. Roch had no medical training, but he insisted he could heal illnesses and injuries through divine power, or his own surgeries. These so-called treatments were horrifying. Without anesthesia, he would cut into people's bodies with knives or pliers, claiming he was removing toxins. In reality, he was causing permanent damage and unbearable pain. Some followers tried to leave during this period. One woman escaped briefly, only to be tracked down by other members who had been ordered to bring her back. Another woman contacted authorities, but with limited evidence and the group's remote location, no rescue came. Each failed escape attempt only made Roch more violent toward those who stayed. In 1984, a disturbing event drew the attention of police for the first time. One of the commune's children died under suspicious circumstances. Roch claimed it was an accident, that the child had been trampled by a horse, but injuries on the body didn't match his story. Authorities investigated, but witnesses, terrified of Roch's wrath, refused to speak against him. Without testimony, the case stalled, and Roch used the investigation as proof of his prophecy. The outside world is the enemy. The death marked a turning point. From then on, fear was no longer an undercurrent. It was the air they breathed. Roch began targeting specific members for extreme abuse, often at random. Some women were beaten until they collapsed. Men were humiliated in front of the group, stripped of any dignity or authority. He wanted every single person to feel powerless except him. By 1985, there were over a dozen children in the commune, most fathered by Roch himself. The group moved yet again to an even more remote location near Burnt River, Ontario, where access to outside help was nearly impossible. It was here that the Ant Hill kids became completely invisible to the world. But while Roch believed his power was unshakable, cracks were forming that he couldn't see. Years of hunger, exhaustion, and trauma had worn his followers down. Whispers of escape began circulating again, this time more desperate, more determined. Some of the younger members were beginning to question whether Roch was truly a prophet or just a man using religion as a weapon. And soon, one act of violence would shatter what little control he still had and force the outside world to finally see the horrors inside the Ant Hill Kids commune. It was 1988 when the most disturbing chapter in the Ant Hill Kids story began to unfold. The one that would finally put Roch Thériault's name into Canadian crime history for all the wrong reasons. By this point, the commune was living in almost complete isolation. The small cabins they had built in the dense forest near Burnt River were rough and damp. Winters were brutal, summers swarmed with insects, and food was always scarce. But the real danger wasn't the elements, it was Roch. Alcohol had fully taken over his life. The man who once spoke calmly about spiritual awakening was now a volatile tyrant. Drinking made his punishments unpredictable. A wrong look, a hesitation before obeying, even a sigh could trigger hours of abuse. His healing sessions had become increasingly violent. Roch began performing amputations and extractions on healthy body parts, claiming they were diseased. He used knives, pliers, even a blowtorch, with no anesthesia. These weren't medical procedures. They were acts of dominance, designed to remind everyone he had the power of life and death. One of the most infamous incidents involved a woman named Gabrielle Lavallee, a devoted follower who had been with the commune for years. Gabrielle had a stomachache, something that, in a normal world, would require rest or maybe a trip to a doctor. But in Roch's twisted reality, he decided it was life-threatening. In front of other members, he ordered her to lie down on the kitchen table. Using nothing but a hunting knife, he cut into her abdomen, claiming to relieve the pressure. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just a rag for her to bite down on. When she screamed, he called it weakness. When she bled, he said it was the evil leaving her body. Gabrielle survived that first operation, but the damage to her trust was irreversible. She began secretly plotting her escape, something she'd never dared to do before. By now, The children in the commune were also starting to suffer severe health problems. Malnutrition, untreated infections, and constant exposure to violence were taking their toll. Some had visible scars from Roch's punishments. Others had learned to remain silent and expressionless to avoid his attention. Outside the commune, small cracks in Roch's secrecy were forming. A few former members had made it out and spoken to police, but their stories sounded so extreme that authorities struggled to believe them without concrete evidence. Social workers had visited once but were kept away from the cabins and told everything was fine. Then came the breaking point. In 1989, Gabrielle Lavallee endured another horrific treatment at Roch's hands, this time far worse than before. He believed her arm was infected and needed to be amputated. Without hesitation, and without any medical reason, he used a chainsaw to remove it. Gabrielle didn't scream this time. She stayed silent, knowing any sign of pain might lead to worse. But inside, she made a decision. If she survived, she would tell the world. That chance came when she convinced Roch to let her visit a nearby town, claiming she needed to run an errand for the commune. Once out of his sight, she went straight to the police. Her story, every brutal detail, was finally heard by someone who believed her. Authorities moved quickly. They gathered statements from other escapees, pieced together years of abuse, and built a case strong enough to raid the commune. When they arrived, they found the anthill kids still in their cabins, living in squalor. Many were malnourished, some were injured, and the children showed clear signs of neglect. The police took everyone into custody, separating the children from the adults. For the first time in over a decade, Roch Thériault no longer had control over his family. But as shocking as the rescue was, investigators were about to uncover even more disturbing truths buried in the group's history. Acts so dark they would leave Canada stunned. When police brought the anthill kids into custody, the full scale of Roch Thériault's abuse began to surface, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. The children, once separated from Roch and his inner circle, began to speak in fragments. They didn't understand that what they had lived through was abnormal. To them, the endless labor, the hunger, and the punishments was simply life. Social workers noticed the way they flinched at raised voices, the way they looked for Roch before answering even the simplest questions. It was as if they were still waiting for his approval, even in his absence. Meanwhile, the adults who had escaped earlier now came forward without fear of retaliation. Their testimonies matched Gabrielle Lavallee's and added more horrific details. There were stories of followers being forced to break their own legs with hammers, of teeth being pulled out with pliers, of people being burned, cut, and mutilated under the guise of divine healing. One death stood out in particular. A 2-year-old boy named Samuel Giguère had died years earlier after being beaten during a toilet training incident. Instead of seeking help, Roch had buried the child's body on the commune's property. The death had never been reported, and the boy's mother, still under Roch's control at the time, hadn't dared speak of it until now. Police dug deeper, literally. They searched the grounds around the cabins and found evidence of shallow graves. Not every body could be conclusively identified, but the discovery made one thing certain. This was not just a case of abuse. People had died here, and Roch's followers had either been too terrified or too brainwashed to stop it. When confronted, Roch showed no remorse. In interviews, he spoke calmly, as if explaining a simple truth, insisting that everything he had done was for the good of his people. He claimed he was acting on God's orders, that pain was a form of spiritual purification. He denied being a murderer. In his mind, he was a savior. In 1993, Roch went to trial for the charges that authorities could prove beyond doubt: the aggravated assault on Gabrielle Lavallee, the death of Samuel Giguère, and multiple counts of bodily harm to other members. Gabrielle testified in court, detailing the amputations, the beatings, and the psychological control. Her calm, matter-of-fact delivery made it even more chilling. The jury didn't take long. Roch Thériault was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The courtroom erupted in relief. For the survivors, it wasn't justice for every crime. Too much had gone undocumented. Too many victims had stayed silent. But it was enough to ensure Roch would never again control another human being. As the members tried to rebuild their lives outside the commune, the psychological scars remained. Many struggled to adapt to the outside world, to learn basic freedoms like choosing their own meals or speaking without fear. Some changed their names to avoid the stigma of having been in the Anthill Kids. Others kept their past hidden altogether. Roch, however, continued to see himself as a prophet even behind bars. He wrote letters to former followers, some of whom still believed in him. The cult's physical walls had been torn down, but its mental chains lingered. For most Canadians, the Anthill Kids case was a shocking revelation that such horrors could happen in their own country, not in some far-off land, but deep in the forests of Ontario and Quebec. Yet for those who had lived it, the real horror was knowing how easily it had all begun, with a man who seemed kind, offering a new way of life, and a group of people searching for something to believe in. But the story didn't end with Roch's conviction. More than a decade later, news from prison would remind the world of his name, and bring a violent close to the life of Canada's most infamous cult leader. Life in prison didn't change Roch Thériault's delusions of grandeur. Even behind concrete walls and steel bars, he behaved like the ruler of a kingdom reduced to the few loyal followers who still wrote to him. Some of these women, despite everything, refused to believe the accusations. They clung to the image of the man who had once spoken of love, community, and salvation, refusing to reconcile it with the brutal reality that had been proven in court. Roch fed that loyalty with letters filled with biblical references, promises of eternal reward, and self-pity. In his mind, he was a martyr, a prophet punished by a world too blind to see the truth. Prison staff quickly realized he was manipulative. He could charm when it suited him, convince others to bend small rules, and subtly stir tension among inmates. But without alcohol and with a strictly controlled environment, his violent rages were less frequent, though his arrogance never faded. For the survivors outside prison, his continued existence was a shadow that never quite went away. Some lived in fear that one day, somehow, he might find a way to contact them. Others fought to move on, starting new families, finding work, and trying to erase the years spent in the forest under his control. But the psychological damage ran deep. Nightmares, anxiety, and an inability to trust were common. In interviews years later, Gabrielle Lavallee spoke about how difficult it had been to recover. Even after Roch's conviction, she said she sometimes caught herself wondering if she'd done the right thing by going to the police, not because she doubted the abuse, but because of the years of conditioning that made her feel guilt for betraying him. It was proof of just how deeply his influence had been etched into their minds. Meanwhile, public fascination with the case continued. Books, documentaries, and news specials revisited the Anthill Kids, each trying to understand how a man with no real religious authority, no medical training, and no resources could gain such total control over dozens of people. Experts pointed to a combination of charisma, isolation, and psychological manipulation. Once someone was inside the commune, with no outside contact and constant reinforcement of Roch's version of reality, escape became almost impossible. But time is a way of catching up with even the most notorious criminals. In February 2011, after more than 2 decades behind bars, Roch's reign came to a violent end. On the morning of February 26th, guards at Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick found him dead in his cell. His body bore multiple stab wounds, and the killer was quickly identified, a fellow inmate named Matthew MacDonald, serving a life sentence for murder. MacDonald didn't run or deny it. In fact, he reportedly told prison staff exactly what he'd done and handed over the homemade weapon. His reason? He simply said, "I killed him. That's all." Later, in court, he added that he didn't want to share a cell with Roch anymore and that he didn't like the man. The news of Roch's death spread quickly, reigniting interest in the case. For many of the survivors, it brought a complicated mix of emotions, relief that he was gone, but also a reminder of the years of trauma he had caused. There was no final apology, no moment of remorse. He died as he had lived in the commune, convinced he was right. But for the world, the end of Roch Thériault's life wasn't the end of the Anthill Kid's story. The scars he left behind, physical, emotional, and generational, would never fully fade. And the lessons from his cult would remain as a grim warning of how easily faith can be twisted into a weapon in the wrong hands. When the news of Roch Thériault's death reached the survivors, reactions were mixed. Some felt an instant, almost physical weight lift from their shoulders, a sense that the man who had haunted their dreams for decades could no longer touch them. Others felt nothing at all, as if he had already been gone the day police raided the commune. But for most, it stirred up memories they had spent years trying to bury. Rebuilding life after the Anthill Kids was never going to be simple. Many survivors had entered the commune in their teens or early 20s, leaving behind families, jobs, and education. Coming out of that environment was like stepping into an entirely different world. Basic choices, what to eat, what to wear, where to go, felt overwhelming after years of having every decision made for them. Some were placed in counseling programs, but the trauma was deep and complex. Survivors spoke of flashbacks triggered by simple things: the smell of wood smoke, the sound of boots on snow, the sight of certain kitchen tools. Nightmares were common. Many found it difficult to trust anyone in a position of authority. The children faced their own uphill battle. Many had never attended a real school before. They had to learn not only academics, but also how to socialize in a world they had been taught was dangerous and corrupt. Some were adopted or placed with relatives, but the stigma of their past followed them into adulthood. A few changed their names to start fresh, erasing the connection to the commune. For years after the raid, the media continued to revisit the case. Documentaries, books, and interviews sought to answer the question: how had this happened in modern Canada, without authorities stepping in sooner? Former members described how Roch kept them isolated, moving the commune to more remote locations whenever suspicion grew. They spoke about the psychological techniques he used, alternating kindness with cruelty, creating an emotional dependency that made leaving feel impossible. Criminal psychologists pointed out that Roch's methods were a textbook example of coercive control. He stripped away his followers' support systems, kept them in a constant state of fear and exhaustion, and made them believe that any suffering they endured was for their own good. Over time, this warped reality became normal for those inside. But the Anthill Kids case also became a rallying point for advocates demanding better protection for vulnerable communities. Social services and law enforcement began re-examining how they handled tips about isolated groups. The case exposed the gaps in the system, the missed opportunities where intervention could have saved lives. Even so, the survivors rarely spoke publicly. Many preferred to disappear into anonymity, focusing on building quiet, ordinary lives. Gabrielle Lavalley remained one of the few willing to share her story, appearing in interviews to warn others about how manipulation and abuse can hide behind the mask of religion and community. Her calm, matter-of-fact recounting of the horrors she endured became a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it walks in smiling. By the 2010s, the Anthill Kids had become a case studied in criminology courses and cited in discussions about cult dynamics. But for those who lived it, it was not history. It was something that still lived in their bodies and minds. They carried it in their scars, in their fears, and in the quiet moments when they caught themselves glancing over their shoulder. Roch was gone, but the aftershocks of his control would echo for the rest of their lives. And the more the public learned about the hidden details of what had happened in those cabins, the more disturbing the truth became. Because while the raid had stopped the abuse, it couldn't erase the years of violence. And it couldn't answer the question that haunted everyone who heard the story: how many more Anthill Kids might still be out there, living under someone else's control? Even after the Anthill Kids commune was dismantled and Roch Thériault was imprisoned, the survivors' stories continued to reveal layers of horror that had gone unnoticed for years. Many of these accounts were so dark and painful that they had been kept hidden, locked away behind walls of fear and shame. One of the most disturbing revelations involved the twisted rituals Roch imposed on his followers. Under the guise of spiritual cleansing, these rituals were brutal exercises in control and humiliation. Members were forced to fast for days, endure public confessions, and perform humiliating acts to demonstrate loyalty. Failure to comply meant punishment, often violent and degrading. Women in the commune faced a particular nightmare. Roch declared himself a divine prophet chosen to father a new generation of believers and took multiple wives, some of whom were very young. These women were subjected to sexual abuse, often under threat of punishment or exile. The abuse was not only physical but psychological. Many were made to believe this was their divine duty. Resistance was met with cruelty and intimidation. Children raised in the commune suffered deeply. They were subjected to harsh discipline, locked in confined spaces for long hours, denied proper medical care, and exposed to the violent punishments given to adults. Many bore physical scars from Roch's brutal surgeries and constant beatings. Their childhoods were stolen, replaced with fear and pain. Within the commune, whispers of resistance began to spread quietly. Some members risked punishment by secretly documenting the abuse or trying to shield the children. A handful even attempted to escape, but were often caught and returned. One courageous woman managed to smuggle letters outside the commune, begging for intervention, but these pleas went largely unanswered for years. Psychologists later identified the intense psychological hold Roch had over his followers as trauma bonding, a condition where victims develop emotional attachments to their abuser, making escape and recovery incredibly difficult. Survivors described feeling trapped between love, fear, and obligation, unable to fully accept that Roch was the monster they feared. Yet even amid the horror, small acts of kindness and hope endured. Members comforted each other, shared moments of laughter, and held on to dreams of freedom. It was this fragile hope that ultimately fueled their courage to resist and, eventually, to break free. The Anthill Kid's story remains a grim warning. Cults thrive in isolation, where control can grow unchecked and horrors unfold out of sight. It is a reminder that sometimes, the darkest places are those we cannot see. The story of the Anthill Kids did not end with Roch Thériault's imprisonment, or even his violent death inside prison walls. For many survivors, the aftermath was just the beginning of a lifelong struggle to reclaim their identities, their freedom, and their humanity. Once freed from the commune's brutal grip, survivors faced the enormous challenge of reintegrating into a world that was both foreign and overwhelming. Many had never experienced normal social interactions, education, or even simple freedoms like choosing what to eat or when to sleep. Everyday decisions that most take for granted became sources of anxiety and confusion. Therapy and support groups provided some relief, but trauma from years of physical abuse, psychological manipulation, and sexual violence left deep scars. Nightmares, flashbacks, and mistrust haunted many. Survivors spoke of the difficulty in separating themselves from a man who once ruled their lives so completely, how his voice and threats echoed long after his physical presence was gone. Some survivors chose to share their stories publicly, using their experiences to raise awareness about cult dynamics and abuse. Gabrielle Lavallee, who bravely escaped and testified against Roch, became a voice for many who could not speak. Through documentaries, interviews, and books, she helped the world understand how someone like Roch could wield such devastating power. At the same time, the Anthill Kids case became a catalyst for changes in law enforcement and social services in Canada. Authorities examined their failures to intervene sooner, improving protocols for investigating isolated groups and responding to signs of abuse. The hope was to prevent another tragedy like this from happening again. Yet, even with justice served and reforms in place, the shadows of the Anthill Kids linger. Survivors carried their trauma into adulthood, often struggling with relationships, trust, and self-worth. The children born into the commune faced particular challenges, navigating identities shaped by both innocence and horror. For the public, the Anthill Kids became a stark lesson in how easily faith can be exploited and how isolation can turn hope into horror. Roch Thériault's legacy is not just one of violence, but a chilling reminder that charismatic leaders, unchecked by oversight or accountability, can create worlds of suffering hidden behind closed doors. This is not just a story about a cult. It is a cautionary tale about power, control, and the fragility of human freedom. And while the Anthill Kids may have disbanded decades ago, the echoes of their story remind us all to stay vigilant, because evil often hides where we least expect it.